Doug, no worries.
Right, brilliant. I'll just take myself off screen and then you can start whenever.
Cool, no worries. Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast, brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones, joined by Phil Smith. No James Copley this week. He's off skiving, so you're stuck with the two of us instead. Plenty to discuss, isn't there, Phil, at the moment? Obviously, we're in the midst of the January transfer window, and we're going to get into some transfer talk in a bit. But before that, we've kind of got to speak about the game on Saturday afternoon. Disappointing result for Sunderland, I think it's fair to say. Playing bottom of the table, Plymouth Argyle came away with a 2-2 draw, but obviously within that, conceded a very, very late goal there that ultimately took 2 points away from Regis Labris' side. I mean, what did you make of the game? Because it kind of felt to me as if it was one of those that not only was it a disappointing result, but it wasn't a great performance either.
No, it was. I think in a lot of ways it was probably one of the most disappointing afternoons of the season. I think actually, which sounds a bit bizarre when you've actually drawn a game, but I think the circumstances around it, obviously the fact that Sheffield United had lost at home the night before, the fact that we know that Burnley and Leeds are playing on Monday night. Some people might know the result of that listening to this, but it felt like it was a huge opportunity against a Plymouth side who, not just bottom of the league, but have had a really atrocious away record this season. It felt like a really big opportunity for Sunderland to make some ground and really put themselves in the equation. And as you say, it wasn't just the result. It's like, it's football. Any team can concede a late goal when a ball gets sort of launched into their box. But I think the manner of the performance from start to finish really was incredibly disappointing. The first half, I thought Sunderland were quite sloppy, couldn't really find the intensity. And then even after Isidore equalised in the second half, I think arguably, they arguably got even worse in terms of the intensity was there, but the shape just seemed to completely disappear. And to be fair, I think it would have been really harsh on Plymouth if Sunderland had won. It was a great finish from Trahim, obviously, to make it 2-1, but Plymouth looked like they could score pretty much all the way through the second half. And I think they absolutely deserved their win. I think Labris, said to us afterwards in his press conference that Sunderland were actually a bit lucky to get a point out of the game. And I think you have to agree. Sunderland really, really struggled to create any clear-cut chances through the game. But Plymouth, certainly in the second half, were probably the stronger of the two teams.
Few raised eyebrows when the team news was announced. Semedo getting his first start for the club. I mean, did you feel like it was the right game to give him those minutes? Obviously, a lot of people perhaps suggesting that it was maybe a touch too conservative from Labris.
It felt a little bit during the first half. It felt like a little bit of an unnecessary move to have a defensive midfielder in for that game. And that, we talked a little bit on our sort of reaction video that it was a bit of a strange one because we've said quite a lot over the last couple of years that there have been loads of games where we really feel like Sunderland missed having a kind of natural defensive midfielder. Actually, this was one of the games where you would have been fine with Dan Neil playing that role because actually there was quite a bit of onus on the defensive midfielder to produce some tempo and some creativity. I think it was always going to be a big ask for Semedo on what was his first start for the club to produce that level of intensity that was probably required to get Sunderland moving and to create chances. So it was a really strange call. Obviously Labris explained it afterwards, and there was a logic to it, which is we've all said all season that there isn't enough depth in the squad, and that it's going to cost Sunderland because it's hard for Labris to make substitutions when players get injured. There's not enough depth there, players who can come in at the same level. So you can totally understand that Labris wanted to find an opportunity to give Semedo a start so that he's ready for, Leeds away in 3 weeks' time. If he feels like he needs Semedo, he can play him because he's match fit and he's got minutes and he's got some experience in the Championship. So I can understand it. But I think that ultimately it was something that didn't really work. I thought the whole mood was off. Like it felt really complacent right from the first whistle, just the whole vibe around the game. And I think collectively there was Plymouth were underestimated, I think, off the back of what happened to them. And I think the Semedo decision, even if there was a logic to it, it did feel like a little bit part of that, just maybe assuming that it might be quite a comfortable afternoon. But the one thing I would say as well is when Semedo went off the pitch, something got worse. So it's not as if Semedo came off, something changed formation, and suddenly everything was fixed. Something actually really were probably too open after Semedo went off. So I guess that's the one bit of sort of the one thing we should say is that we definitely can't pin the result and the performance on Semedo playing because actually, there were even bigger issues when he wasn't there.
I mean, obviously not the debut he would have wanted, or full debut rather, that he would have wanted. But you mentioned their prospective Leeds in a few weeks coming up. I mean, have you seen enough from him in the few glimpses that we've had to suggest that he still has a role to play, and he is a different sort of player that can bring something to that midfield trio?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I don't think we've seen the best of him yet in terms of I think he's looking to find his rhythm and his sharpness, especially in possession. I thought he had a positive impact at Derby in midweek, and I suspect that was probably one of the reasons why Lebris felt he could put him in the team on Saturday. I thought at Derby it was a time in the game when Sunderland were really struggling to put pressure on the ball. I thought Sam had brought a lot of energy. He managed to get Sunderland's press going again, which is something that they pretty much lost in the second half, which was really important. It meant Derby were playing, sort of quite hopeful punts from deep rather than crossing it from the byline where it was really dangerous. So I do think that, as you said, for a long time, it's a speciality really, that position that Sunderland have not had in their squad since Corey Evans did his ACL really. And I do think there's potentially a role for it. And I think that Brees will really feel pleased that he's got that option, whether it's from the bench or whether it starts even, Middlesbrough away. That's going to be a really tough game a week today. So I definitely think there's no way we should be writing Semedo off on the basis of that game. And, and Lebris was very strong afterwards that why he kind of accepted the criticism because Sunderland had performed poorly. He felt that Semedo getting these minutes is something that would be a net positive in the long run. And I guess we'll see on that. But for me, I do think it gives Sunderland a bit of versatility and a few different ways of playing, which I do think would be a benefit. And as I say, hopefully, Samed will be better for getting some match sharpness in. But as we said, it felt like the intensity and the tempo was definitely off on Saturday. And to be fair, I don't think that was just Samed. I think you could point to a lot of Sunderland players who've been brilliant all season, and so there's no need to go overboard in criticism. But Saturday just weren't where they were. Where they have been, for most of the season. There's very few players who you could say were anywhere near their best.
I mean, what do you put that down to, Phil? Is it a case of Sunderland literally just being complacent, coming up against a team at the bottom of the division? Is it a case of them seeing Burnley put 5 past Plymouth a few days earlier and perhaps thinking that that's almost beaten Plymouth before they've even stepped out on the pitch? Is it just the case that Sunderland had 2 away trips in a matter of days and then have had to go back to the Stadium of Light and play a team who are fighting for their lives in the Championship?
Yeah, I suspect it's probably a bit of both, to be fair. It definitely felt like the intensity wasn't there. Maybe the fatigue of, everything that happened at Burnley. And then Derby was a hard game as well. That wasn't a comfortable second half for Sunderland, so that they put a lot of energy in sort of defending their box in that second half. I do think that probably, there was a bit of underestimating Plymouth. And I think Plymouth had a big reaction from their midweek performance. I think it was pretty clear from speaking to, the Plymouth manager after the game and also sort of Plymouth sort of journalists and stuff that there was a huge difference in performance levels. And I think they brought a level of aggression and organisation that maybe they've struggled to match for most of the season. So, yeah, I think it's probably a combination of factors, and it's one of those there's going to be loads of twists and turns between now and the end of the season. But it did just feel like such an important afternoon for someone to get 3 points to take. You don't get too many opportunities to make ground on pretty much every team around you, and my fear is that this is going to be one where we look back at the end of the season and say that was a really, really costly result. Fingers crossed that's not the case. If they beat Middlesbrough next week, it might look very, very different all of a sudden. But yeah, right now, I think everyone's feeling a little bit deflated on Wearside, aren't they? It was that kind of afternoon.
It was, and I think it's always the case as well when you concede a late goal, and this is not the first time it's happened to Sunderland this season. It's becoming a pattern. I think it's fair to say at this stage where we've seen it happen multiple times over the course of the campaign so far. I mean, how much of a concern is it for Sunderland that they can't seem to put these games to bed?
Yeah, it's a big concern, to be fair, and especially on Saturday, really, that the manner of the second goal, it's really hard to Sunderland should have had the players on the pitch to deal with that. Really, when you look at it, it's just fairly hopeful balls into the box, and by that point, Sunderland have 4 centre halves on the pitch plus Trey Hume, and you really think, especially with Ballard who come on as a substitute, that Sunderland should be able to deal with that situation. It's a big concern. I felt earlier in the season that probably the main reason why it was happening was because Sunderland, didn't have the game. What we were quite often seeing was the opposition would bring down 4 or 5 subs early in the second half, and Sunderland just didn't really have those options. So my feeling for a while it was basically a fatigue issue. It's harder to make that case now, really, because obviously we're in a situation where Lebris now does have options where he can make quite a few substitutions. So it's one of those where, like, I think from Lebris's perspective, he's looking at it and going, well, I've got the players on the pitch to deal with what I knew Plymouth were going to do, which was to launch balls into the box, basically. But it's something that someone definitely have to consider, and maybe it's one of those. Do you have to start viewing it the other way now and saying, if we're struggling to defend our box, do we stop inviting pressure? Do we stop bringing defenders on? Do we try and do it the other way and try and get some more creative players on and try and keep the ball in the opposition half? Do we get more runners on to try and stretch the opposition? I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but at the minute it's so costly for Sunderland that I think it's very clearly something that they're going to have to address. Because even on midweek on Derby against Derby, they were a bit fortunate, weren't they? Derby had a lot of chances in that second half, so it's a real Achilles heel for Sunderland. I don't think it should be happening anymore, because we know that those options are there that they weren't earlier in the season. So it's maybe something now. Do they have to consider things tactically? I think everything has to be on the table, doesn't it, moving forward, because it's really costing Sunderland at the moment.
And obviously, you mentioned those creative players there. Just a quick word on Enzo Lafayette. Another bright performance from him. Obviously, he's playing slightly out of position, but there looks to be a proper talent in there, doesn't there?
I thought he was Sunderland's best player by quite a distance in the first half, to be honest. I thought pretty much everything that was good came from him. He's got a bit of pace about him, which isn't something I necessarily knew about him before he came. Obviously, his touch is absolutely tremendous. He makes things happen. Really, really excited about what he can bring. I did think he tired quite severely in the second half. I don't think he was anywhere near as influential. To be honest, I might have liked to have seen him come off after about an hour, because I think you could tell that he was struggling to do what he did in the first half. So I think maybe that was a little bit of a mistake on Lebris's part, but I don't think there's any doubt Sunderland have got a big player there, and I'm excited. Hopefully in a couple of weeks we can see him in his strongest position where he can maybe do some even more damage.
So at the time of recording, there is exactly 1 week to go in the transfer market. Obviously, so far Sunderland have only brought in the one player, Enzo Lafayette, but we do know that they are after more reinforcements. Phil, I just want to sort of talk through the state of play on Weir's side at the present moment in time, and we might as well start with potential incoming signings. And obviously, the hunt for attacking reinforcement continues. I mean, where do we stand with that at the present moment in time?
Yeah, I think it's probably the one position really that we know Sunderland definitely want to recruit. I think midfield now is looking pretty stacked when you consider that Alan Brown's not too far off coming back. Defensively, I know a lot of fans would like to see Sunderland sign some more fullback cover because of Adjili's injury, but I think Lebris has been pretty clear that unless he gets another one injury this week, he's happy with what he's got. He sees it as having 6 players for 4 positions, and he's happy with that. So really, the forward line is the only real area that the Sunderland need to recruit. But I think what we've seen this month is it's not an easy market for them to deal in, because they don't have the finances because of parachute payments that some of the clubs around them do. Hence why Sheffield United can commit to reported around 10 million on Tom Cannon, whereas Sunderland preferred a loan initially. So I think it's quite a tricky one to do. And the problem with loan deals, which is the obvious alternative, is that you can't offer really any player any guarantees over the game time, because you've got Isidore doing well, Meander doing well, Patrick Roberts, and even on the left flank where there's clearly an opening right now where a player could come in and play, you've got Romain Mundle and Tommy Watson. Both should be back at some time in February. So, it's a really tricky one to do, and I think that's why Sunderland have been looking at some quite versatile players. Because I think that's probably the best guarantee you can give a player that they might be able to get into the teams if they can fit a few different positions. I think the thing that Lebris has been really clear about is that what he would like is more pacing behind. He describes them as vertical threats, if you like, and I think that's the main thing he wants. He wants players who can stretch the game, who can turn the opposition defence. I think he's quite open-minded. If that's a number 9 as we understand it, then that's great. Get them in and he'll make it work. If that's a slightly more, if it's like a second striker who likes to run beyond, then that's fine. If it's a winger who can play through the middle, that's fine. So I think it's more about the attributes of the player and the quality they can bring, rather than necessarily a positional one. Because I do think if Touchwood, Mundle, and Watson recover successfully, Sunderland are in pretty good order across most positions. So yeah, I think that's the big one, and I think the big thing is adding quality rather than quantity. I think it's probably going to be a quieter week income-wise than we're used to, but hopefully it'll be a name that a player that excites people in the way that obviously Enzo Lefebvre did earlier in the window.
I mean, it does certainly feel as if, in terms of the speculation that's doing the rounds, it does feel as if there's been a move towards that, where it's not necessarily just number nines, it's not just centre forwards, and it does also feel as if some of the names that have been mentioned are of that sort of premium quality. Obviously Chuba Akpom linked in recent days. We've seen Semi Kiliksoy, who's on the books at Besiktas. He's been mentioned as a target as well. I mean, obviously not asking for specific news on either of those because it is a lot of speculation at the present moment in time, but it does feel as if there is a real emphasis on getting the right man rather than just any man through the door.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think like the Akpom one's probably a great example of a player who obviously Sunderland would be interested in if he's available because of the championship record he's got. And the fact that he's a player who you could definitely see competing for first team minutes pretty much straight away. I think that one would be quite tricky to do. From what I understand, there are a lot of potential hurdles and quite a complex deal. So I think it would probably be quite unlikely at this stage. But having said that, that's exactly what everyone said when Sunderland were first linked with Enzo Lefebvre. They were able to get him through the door. So that's a great lesson, really, that things can change so quickly and always expect the unexpected. But you're definitely right. And I think it's in terms of it is about quality rather than quantity. And I expect Sunderland will do a deal this week. But I think there's a world in which they don't if it's not the right player. I think that probably what's changed over the last sort of 2 months is that Isidore now, I think he's a centre forward in the Sunderland team, isn't he? I can't imagine us ever really seeing him out on the left again. And Mienda, I know he had a bit of a tough time coming off the bench on Saturday, but generally speaking, he's been excellent. So I think there's a definite understanding that it's about adding a player. You don't need to just stockpile forwards. There's a lot of quality in the Sunderland group. And I think it's just about if you've got a player who you feel can be a bit of a game changer, then you have to go and do it. And I think it does make sense because we're sort of crossing our fingers with Mundell, Watson, Poveda. These are all players who, if they get fully fit, will make a difference. But we know what it's like. Sometimes you can have a setback, sometimes you can have a recurrence, sometimes it can take you a while to find a little bit of rhythm. So I do think it's important that they bring someone in. But maybe it's changed a little bit from where we were, say, 2 months ago, where it was like we really need to get a centre forward in. I think it's a little bit different now. I think it's a case of saying if we can get a really good player in, it could make all the difference.
And in terms of other transfer priorities, obviously we've seen a lot of speculation surrounding the likes of Job and Chris Rigg, Dan Neil being the most recent one as well. Talks of Everton potentially taking interest in him last week. I mean, is that another thing that you expect Sunderland to be able to do, to hang on to those players over the coming days?
Yeah, I think I've been sort of quietly confident right from the start coming in this window that Sunderland were in a really good position with these players in this window. I think we all have to be pretty realistic about some of the talent that some of these players have. And if Sunderland aren't a Premier League team next season, I think there's quite a few players who's going to be really, really difficult to retain. But I think at the moment, these players, many of them had the option to or could have pursued a move to the top tier last summer if they'd wanted to. They didn't want to do that because they felt they had unfinished business here and they felt that it was still an environment where it was best for them to develop at that point. And since then, it's only been positive, hasn't it, with a new head coach, with the results. And I think there's definitely a feeling that that these players feel as if they could achieve something really, really special in their career, that the opportunity they have right now and the sort of spirit in the dressing room is quite a rare thing. And I don't think they want to walk away from it. The summer might be a different thing. Obviously, the slight difference with Dan Neil, who you mentioned there, in comparison to, say, Job or Chris Rigg, is that contractually Sunderland aren't in quite as strong a position because obviously he's got 18 months left. So there is a slight element of concern there. But going back to the point I just made about players not wanting to leave mid-season, I'd be absolutely stunned if Dan Neil had any interest in leaving right now. Like, we've spoken to him a lot over the years, and he's always been so clear that his sort of goal and his dream was to take Sunderland back from League One to sort of where they belong in the Premier League. And when they're so close to potentially doing that, whether it's automatics or playoffs or whatever, I just don't see him wanting to move this month. As I said with the Lefebvre thing, that's a great example of things can change so quickly. But it's something that I've always felt that Sunderland are in a strong position in this window. In the long run, do I worry about this team getting broken up if they don't win promotion this season? I definitely do. I think that's a big concern. But I don't quite see it in this window. I think I really expect that Sunderland will finish this window without any, what we would probably say, high-profile departures.
In terms of other potential departures, though, obviously there's a few names kicking about. I mean, Adil Ashish, it's an interesting situation with him, isn't it? Because I think a few months ago we all would have just assumed that he would have been a candidate to leave, but obviously he's played his way back into the team. Since then, Labris has perhaps hinted that when other players are fit, he won't have as much of a prominent role to play. I mean, do you see him still being a Sunderland player this time next week, or do you think he could be off to seek a challenge elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one because your instinct just said, look, like we know what he can contribute. He's a really good option to have. Just keep him. You never know what's going to happen with injuries. But I think the flip side of that is whether that's fair to the player, because we've seen since Lefay came in. I don't think he's had a minute over the last 3 games since Lefay came in, has he? I might be wrong on that, but he certainly hasn't featured very prominently. And then when you add Alan Brown coming back into the mix over the next couple of weeks, Mundell, Watson, potentially another forward coming in who might be a versatile player who can play off the left or as a 10. I just think it's really difficult to see him getting any kind of regular minutes. And at that point, like, I don't know how fair it is to just basically ask him to stick around and kick his heels and hope that he might get 10 minutes off the bench every now and then. So I think that's probably the one which I think there's the most uncertainty going over into the last week of this window. My instinct is that he might well stay because he's proven before that he can play his way into Labris's plans. Labris won't be pushing him out the door because he'd be very, very happy to have a player of his caliber on, in reserve, if you like. So my gut tells me that he might well stay, but I definitely think it's something that will. I think that one might go down to the wire, because if someone do get that high quality, versatile forward player in that we're talking about, it's really, really hard to see where Aushish's minutes are going to come from in that scenario. It might well be best for all parties to just say, look, even if it's only on loan initially, just get yourself out there and play, and we'll take a breath and reconsider in the summer. But that's going to be a really interesting one to see both what Sunderland want to do and what Aushish himself wants to do, because we saw it in the summer. He's in no rush to leave. He loves it here. But having said that, if he wants to be playing football, of course he does.
Obviously, a similar situation with Abdullah Bar and Jewison Bennett. Obviously, those two are much further out on the periphery of Labris's plans than Ashish is. But, I mean, is the expectation that those two will probably find another club at some point soon?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you kind of hope so for everybody's sake, wouldn't you? I think, to be bluntly honest, I think they're not even involved with the under-21s at the moment. So it's just not a scenario that's good for their careers. Certainly from Sunderland's point of view, financially, it makes no sense for these guys to be around and not contributing at all. I think with Bennett, obviously, Bennett is so young that he's still got a bit of time on his side. So I think that he's one where maybe it's not the end of the world if he's around for another few months playing under 21s football. But I think ideally you get him out on loan. I think with Barr, you're probably maybe looking at ideally a similar situation to what's happened with Rusin, whereby if there's a permanent offer, you'll consider it. But if it's a loan with an option, like it is with Rusin and Hadjuk split, whereby if they do sign him in the summer, I think Sunderland will pretty much get their money back. I think that would be a pretty acceptable solution to all concerned with Barr. So, yeah, I think it's important that Sunderland, especially with Barr, just draw a line under that and find a move for him to get playing, because it does absolutely nobody any good. It doesn't suit any of the parties if he's not playing regularly between now and the end of the season.
And finally, just a quick word on Harrison Jones as well, under-21s captain, obviously signed a new deal with Sunderland quite recently, but could he potentially be heading out on loan, trying to get some senior experience under his belt?
Yeah, I think it's important that Sunderland find the right club, because as with any loan deal, the worst thing is for him to go out and just not get any minutes whatsoever. And in that scenario, he'd rather he just trains with the first team, where there's obviously a lot of potential development for him to do that, training with players of that calibre. But Sunderland definitely want him to go out on loan, because as we've discussed over the course of the podcast, loads of players coming back in centre midfield. I think it's really difficult to see him getting regular minutes, even though he's rated really highly at Sunderland. So I think if you could find like a National League move for him where he's going to play regularly and get a really good taste of senior football, I think that would be the ideal scenario. So that's definitely a deal that I can see happening this week, and that I'm hopeful will happen this week.
Okay, good stuff. That's all we've got time for in this week's show. Join us again next week when we'll be discussing all of the latest Sunderland news and developments. In the meantime, follow all the latest Black Cats news on the Sunderland Echo. You can give us a follow on social media as well. Thanks to Phil. Thanks to you for listening. We'll see you next week.